Hey guys, so we've had a couple weekends worth of regionals post Phantom Nightmare, so as always, as I've been doing recently, I want to provide an overview of some of the trends in terms of the decks that are topping so that you are up to date with the current meta. And as always, definitely a big thanks to Ivan as well as Renren from YGOPro.com for tracking down all these regional level tops. Really incredible, valuable resource for all Yu-Gi-Oh players, so definitely go check those out. I'll have all the links down below. And of course, definitely go check out my discount codes as well for Yu-Gi-Oh singles as well as sleeves, links in the description below. Alright, so let's just cover the decks that topped in the past couple weekends worth of regionals, and basically Ivan and also YGOPro.com, they were able to track down 292 decks from 37 regionals. There were 40 regionals total in this same span, which basically means they were able to track down about 91% of the topping decks, which is absolutely incredible. And this is basically what it looked like, a third of it being Fire King, and also there were pure Snake Eye as well. Not too surprising, we saw this similar result at the YCS, actually a lot more probably for Fire King and such. Voiceless Voice is one of the new contenders as well. Sure, maybe there's a bit of an initial hype release kind of thing, but at the same time, Voiceless Voice, it really is a very strong deck, so it's definitely warranted. Kashtira still holding strong in its place, you know, after accounting for these new additions with the Phantom Nightmare set, and also branded Despia also keeping strong as well. One thing though is Rescues really fell a lot. I don't know if it's just me that was surprised by this. I thought they would still at least do pretty well, considering it's also another fire deck, and it was also predominantly, you know, getting the most tops just leading up to this Phantom Nightmare format. So those are some of the trends there. So in terms of the trends for the top few decks, worth noting is that essentially for, of course, Fire King, compared to when I did this for the last couple weekends worth of January regionals leading up to Phantom Nightmare, they actually had fallen a little bit back then, but now, of course, really shot up to first place. Kashtira, they were actually second at that point, even though technically, yes, standing-wise, it's gone down, of course. You know, Fire King have become really good, and you also have something like Snake Eye and also Voiceless Voice. They've also entered the mix, but, you know, accounting for that, it's still at least kind of holding its place, and it's still solid. It's a deck that can play Shifter, which does have a pretty good place in this meta, kind of similar to, you know, tier 0 tier limit format. Branded Despia is another deck that's holding quite strong in terms of its placing. You know, I think it is still, I mean, tier 1 and tier 2 is kind of becoming very thin line right now because we are in a tier 0 format basically, but, you know, among some of the top decks that's not Fire King Snake Eye, I think Branded Despia actually has a pretty good chance, and it's certainly a deck that I've been running. And then, as mentioned, Rescue is kind of falling off quite hard. Curious to see whether this trend will continue or whether it will bounce back at some point. Now, of course, there's a variety of different decks that also topped at regional level, and this is, of course, top 8 or better. In those same time span, you had something like, let's say, Chimera. Dragonrider Chimera's certainly fallen off, especially in comparison to Branded Despia, but at the same time, it is still, you know what, still getting some tops, and it is, budget-wise, much more friendly than Branded Despia, if I recall, top of my head. Dragonlink, definitely kind of weird to see it as a rogue deck for sure, but you know, it's still getting some tops here and there. Bystials, of course, not nearly as strong right now when we're in a format where, you know, the best decks are fire. You have something like, let's say, Raid Raptors. That's also a pretty interesting contender right now. I've actually featured a few topping Kashtira, or rather Raid Raptor profiles that you can check out, and we'll cover that in a little bit later as well. So I think it's really interesting. Just a very scary combo deck if it gets to go first. Depending on the build, you can also play a decent amount of non-engine as well, giving you some chance at going second too. And then you have something like Unchained still kind of hanging around, obviously nowhere close to its tier 1 status. I think that's just has been acknowledged that's completely out the window. Orcus has also fallen quite a bit. Of course, I mean, I've kind of said this during my rogue tier list where, you know, there are some initial hype usually after, like, you know, a card becomes unbanned. I mean, you know, not to say that Orcus is bad or anything, but I think the number of tops have definitely drastically dwindled. You have something like Stun, which is always funny and usually really cheap to play. I'll also highlight that deck list near the end of the video. Virtual World also got a couple of tops. Shen is kind of like a walking macrocosmos, so that's kind of nice. And kind of to that vein, Hero also has something like Dark Law, which is a better Shen really, and that also still has a bit of a place right now. Hero actually had multiple regional tops like the month prior to this, leading up to Phantom Nightmare. It's still got one regional top so far at least, so I think the potential is still there. You have something like some other interesting, really cool decks, you know, let's say like Earthbound. I actually recently featured that on my channel at the time of recording. You can check that out as well. Resonator, technically there were multiple, but one kind of fell under, like, let's say Dragonlink. The other was also with like Earthbound, for example, just like a very small package. But you know what, this was something that we've seen last month as well. And you have something like, let's say, Rika still topping after that ban list, multiple hits at that. Sprite is a bit of a pretty big decline, right? It was a solid deck for a long time, but as I kind of mentioned in my rogue tier list as well, because it's kind of got categorized as like the best rogue deck just because of its lack of regional top so far. I do think that it kind of struggles going second when, you know, their bodies get popped, and we're in a Fire King format where they can just pop a lot of things, so not really great for Sprite, but it can play Shifter. Not optimally play under it, but at least it can play and still has usually some potential to OTK under Shifter as well. And then you have some other cool decks, like let's say Yubel, that's a new deck from Phantom Nightmare. It's going to get better post Legacy of Destruction, so I think it's pretty cool that it's already top so far. Same thing can be said with Godi as well, which got some recent support in Phantom Nightmare. Okay, so let's just cover the deck playstyle of these topping decks briefly. And so one thing that's changed is, so previously, leading up to this, I had Fire King as mid-range before the Snake Eye stuff. And I think that was still fair. You know, the deck, or rather the board that they put up wasn't like absolutely crazy. It was like pretty combo and control oriented. But now with the Snake Eye stuff, they're definitely like much more combo oriented. So I kind of shifted the categorization of Fire Kings, and that's why now we're in a very combo heavy format. You have decks like mid-range, like Rescues. Branded Despia is a very classic example of mid-range. So those are some of the play styles going on right now. Not much of stun really, usually for the most part, and control decks like Labyrinth actually not much presence anymore either. Now, in terms of the packages played among the top decks, so no surprise, we have, of course, Diabell Star making up, 45%. Of course, you're essentially kind of considering, Snake Eye, Fire King, but, there are some other decks that sometimes play Diabell Star engine, right? Like, let's say, Manidium sometimes has shown that they play at least the Diabell Star stuff with, like, Jet Synchron because it's a level 1 fire. Of course, just purely because of the fact that most of the decks that are topping are these fire decks, and they're not playing Horus or Bestial or Runic stuff, right? So that's why all the trends for them, of course, indirectly are going down. Although at the same time, if you were to, let's say, focus among the decks that are not Fire King or not Snake Eye, and then these are kind of the percentages among those decks as well. But, even then, something like, let's say, Runic and Bestial, really not seeing that much play among those non-fire decks, just because, at least for Bestial, of course, again, we're in a fire-heavy format, not a lot of Dark and Light as we were before, so definitely that package has gone down in terms of play. And Runic, I'm not too sure. Someone certainly let me know in the comments if there's any kind of real disadvantage of Runic right now, but nonetheless, we're seeing a bit of a decline in that. Next, of course, we're on to a more controversial topic, especially for this format, and that is the deck cost of these topping decks. The cheapest deck that topped the regional was actually Virtual World at around $83 USD. And again, big thanks to YGOPro.com for all this cost information, which is using TCG player prices. Maximum Fire King Snake Eye, it is a pretty expensive deck, $1,300, but a medium being around $700 USD. Like, that is still pretty hefty. In terms of deck-specific cost, Fire King, the cheapest was actually $110, and that was because that particular list was just playing Dogmatica stuff with the Fire King, none of the expensive stuff. So you know what, it did top, but by and large, they're all playing like the Snake Eye stuff. They're playing like the Wanted, the Bonfire, and all that expensive stuff. So median about almost $1,200, going as high as, of course, $1,300. Then you have something like Pure Snake Eye, which is actually even the cheapest Snake Eye deck. That top was still about $1,100 USD. It's pretty stable in terms of price, around $1,200. So it is, of course, a very expensive deck to play. And then you have something like Kashtira, which, as shown earlier, is still pretty holding its place in terms of number of regional tops, anywhere between $500 to $700. So it's not a cheap deck by any means, but you know what? In that rarity set that's coming out in May, at least the planets are getting reprinted, so that's something. But at the very least, you would also have to hope that Shifter survives if you're looking to play Kashtira. And then, of course, the deck that I'm running is Branded Despia. It's something that I've been mentioning quite a lot in terms of, its sort of quote-unquote affordability, at least relatively speaking, in the current meta. So, anywhere between 250 like 450, so usually like 350 plus dollars ish. And we'll cover our highlight Branded Despia deck list that topped as well. But you know what, considering it's placed in the meta, I think it is still a pretty reasonable price. Okay, so lastly, let's just cover some specific deck lists. And as I mentioned, Branded Despia, this is one of the lists that topped one regional that had about 300 players, so pretty decent size. And you can certainly check the profile at Pi for Life Games. And for Branded Despia, usually the most expensive card comes from Thrust. You can cut this to like 2 if you want to sort of save on the cost, but I do think you do need it, not only because access to fusion duplication going first when you get Ash, but going second, it's very strong in this deck because you can use it to search something like Branded Fusion. You can save your Alubra search for let's say Branded Loss, or maybe you don't even have access to that. So Thrust is very good in this deck. But worst case, if you can't afford it, just don't play it. Just play Crossouts instead. You have something like Clem is also pretty expensive. This is something most lists actually played at 1. Definitely 2 is fine as well. So again, if you're looking to cut costs, make some changes there. And so nonetheless, Gimmick Puppet Nightmare probably for the most part is main decked, I would say. But if you want to side it, that's completely fine too. It's actually also getting reprinted in that Battles of Legend Chapter 1 set. So overall, very good deck list, and again, a pretty reasonable reasonable price considering its place in the meta, you know, understanding that, you know, of course, no deck is going to be as good as Fire King or Snake Eye. And then you have the list that I highlighted a little bit earlier in terms of, you know, the cheapest among the decks that top the regional, and that is this virtual world list. You know, pretty straightforward. You know, the hand traps, of course, are very, very cheap. And of course, all the virtual world cards are very, very pennies as well. And so, you know, $82 for this that can top a regional, I think it's solid. Again, Shen being able to be a macro Cosmos on legs is pretty nice in the current format. Only downside with virtual world kind of historically has been that it is a pretty bricky deck. So just keep that in mind. And then you have some Raid Raptor deck lists at top. So I actually featured both of them on my channel, and you can also check out their team PCD's channel as well for the extra Raid Raptor content. You have someone like Garal who finished top 8 at the remote regional, and they also fellow teammates in KP. He also finished top 4 at the same regional with Raid Raptors. I think it's really cool. They both opted to not play the Kali Yuga build. They both built the deck together, and they actually opted to play a lot more hand traps as well, which certainly worked out for them, especially, you know, going second as well. And going first, this deck is really scary, right? Even without Kali Yuga, and being able to, like, trying to get out those towers and multiple of them is really hard, right? So I think it's a really cool, interesting choice. And of course, I always like highlighting some stun decks just because I always think it's pretty funny. Of course, they're not fun to play against, but, you know, they're usually really, really cheap to build and also very easy to pilot. And so I think it's kind of funny that it always sneaks in a couple of regional tops every format. So if you're kind of new to Yu-Gi-Oh, you know, stun decks technically is probably the easiest one to pick up. Although I wouldn't encourage you for playing it too long because players will not like playing against you. But nonetheless, you look at this list, you know, Necro Valley is going to be very, very strong in the current format. You have something like, let's say, Inspector Border. I guess Fossil Dana. There was another deck, stun deck, that topped as well. That one played more of a runic stuff, which is has been pretty common lately. So this one is actually like a cheaper version of that, and so I think it's pretty funny. It's something that, you know, you could try out if you're kind of want to just troll around. All right, guys. So that was it for a quick overview of some of the decks that have been topping the various regionals the past couple of weekends post Phantom Nightmare. Hopefully you found that helpful and interesting. I understand we're in a tier 0 format right now, but hopefully you don't completely give up yet if you're not playing something like Fire King or Snake Eye. There's clearly a lot of different decks that have topped, and there's potential for it to top. So yeah, anyways, thank you for all watching. Huge thanks to my patrons as always for the continued support, and well, take care, guys.